This was not a rumor. It was not propaganda. It was a realization that struck thousands of captured German soldiers in 1944, standing behind barbed wire in prisoner-of-war camps across the continental United States. Camps like Camp Aliceville, Alabama, Camp Concordia, Kansas, and Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Men who had marched across Europe under the banners of the Wehrmacht now found themselves staring at mess trays piled higher than anything they had seen in years. By the spring of 1944, the war had turned decisively against Nazi Germany. The defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk had shattered the myth of German invincibility. Allied bombing raids pounded the Reich day and night. Fuel was scarce, food was rationed. Even front-line units survived on reduced supplies. In Germany itself, civilians and soldiers alike lived on ration cards, ersatz coffee, and thin soups stretched to feed entire families. Little did these German soldiers know what awaited them after capture would force a comparison far more devastating than any battlefield loss. They were not greeted with brutality. They were not starved. They were fed. Most of the men arriving in American POW camps in 1944 had been captured in North Africa, Italy, or after the Allied landings in France. Many belonged to units like the Africa Corps, the 15th Panzer Division, or infantry formations shattered during the Allied advance after D-Day. They crossed the Atlantic in guarded convoys, uncertain of their fate, conditioned by years of Nazi propaganda to expect cruelty at the hands of the enemy. Fear gripped the men as they disembarked on American soil. They expected revenge. What they encountered instead was order, routine, and food. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, the United States was obligated to feed prisoners of war the same rations issued to its own troops. And unlike Germany, the United States had the industrial and agricultural capacity to do exactly that. The camps were run primarily by the U.S. Army Military Police Corps, many of them older soldiers or men unfit for overseas service. Their mission was not punishment. It was containment. On the first full day in camp, German POWs were marched to the mess hall. Long wooden buildings, stainless steel serving counters, the smell of cooked meat hanging in the air, bread stacked in baskets, coffee poured freely. The trays came back heavy, meat, not scraps, but full portions. White bread, not the dark, coarse substitute they knew from home. Potatoes, vegetables, sugar, and coffee that was real coffee. For many of these men, it was the first time since 1941 they had eaten like this. What happened next would become legendary, not because of violence, but because of disbelief. Among the prisoners were seasoned non-commissioned officers and junior officers, Unteroffizier, Feldwebel, even lieutenants, men who had eaten in officers' messes back in Germany before the shortages became severe. They looked down at their trays, then looked at the American guards eating the same food nearby. There was no difference. No special meal for prisoners. No luxury spread for guards. Everyone ate the same rations. One German POW later recalled that moment as more unsettling than captivity itself, because it raised a question he could not escape. If the enemy can feed us this well, what does that say about the war we are fighting? Back in Germany, by 1940, official army rations had been cut repeatedly. Officers often received slightly better portions than enlisted men. But even those were shrinking. Meat was rare. Butter was rationed. Coffee had been replaced by substitutes made from roasted grains or chicory. Letters from home spoke of hunger, cold, and exhaustion, of children growing thin, of civilians queuing for hours. Now these same soldiers were eating better as prisoners than they had as conquerors. The psychological impact was immediate. This was not kindness. It was capacity. The camps themselves were surrounded by farmland. American agriculture was operating at full wartime output. Tractors replaced horses. Mechanized harvesters rolled across fields. Railcars delivered supplies on schedule. There were no shortages here. No desperate substitutions, no collapsing logistics. German POWs noticed everything. They noticed the steady flow of trucks, the warehouses filled with crates stamped U.S. Army, the waste, uneaten bread discarded without ceremony. To men who had learned to save every crumb, it was almost offensive. By 1400 hours each day, meals were served with clockwork precision. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, always on time, always sufficient, always the same quality. Against impossible odds, the United States had turned abundance into routine, and routine into quiet dominance. Among the prisoners were veterans who had fought in Russia, who remembered the bitter cold, the hunger, the endless retreats. Men who had watched comrades collapse not from enemy fire, but from exhaustion and starvation. To them, the contrast was unbearable. They began to talk among themselves, quietly at first, then openly. They compared meals, compared letters from home, compared what they were told by Nazi propaganda with what they were now seeing with their own eyes. The realization crept in slowly, and then all at once, Germany was not losing because of courage, or lack of skill, or even battlefield mistakes. Germany was losing because it could not compete with this. Food became the lens through which everything else was reevaluated. If America could feed millions of soldiers overseas and thousands of enemy prisoners at home, what else could it do? Build ships faster than they could be sunk? Replace tanks as quickly as they were destroyed? Train pilots faster than Germany could shoot them down? The men behind the wire did not need intelligence briefings to understand the truth. They were living inside it. By the end of 1944, many German POWs no longer spoke of victory. Some no longer spoke of return. Instead, they spoke of survival, of what Germany would look like after the war, of whether there would even be enough food waiting for them if they went home. The war had followed them across the ocean, not with bombs or bullets, but with a meal tray. And that was only the beginning. By late 1944, the German prisoners had settled into the rhythms of camp life. Roll calls at dawn, work details in nearby farms or repair depots, evenings spent talking quietly in barracks lit by bare bulbs. But it was not the routine that weighed heaviest on their minds. It was the mail. Letters arrived irregularly, bundled together and distributed under the watchful eyes of American guards. Thin envelopes, familiar handwriting, sometimes weeks old, sometimes censored, lines blacked out. The men opened them slowly, already bracing for what they might contain. What they read confirmed their worst fears. From Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, and small villages across Bavaria and Saxony came the same reports. Ration cards reduced again, meat allocations cut to a few ounces per week, butter nearly impossible to find, coal scarce, apartments unheated, Allied bombings destroying entire neighborhoods overnight. Wives wrote of standing in lines for hours. Mothers wrote of children growing thin. Fathers wrote of factories operating under constant air raid alarms. And officers' families, once protected by status, were no longer spared. One former Feldwebel from the Eastern Front read a letter describing how his brother, an army officer stationed near Vienna, was living on turnips and watery soup. The prisoner folded the letter carefully, stared at it for a long time, then looked down at the half-eaten loaf of white bread still sitting on his bunk. Fear gripped the men, not fear of the guards, but fear of what waited beyond the wire. In the barracks, comparisons became unavoidable. By 1800 hours, dinner had been served. Stew thick with meat, potatoes boiled soft, bread enough for seconds, coffee poured again, not ersatz, real beans. The smell alone carried a weight that reminded many of peacetime Germany, before the war had consumed everything. Across the ocean, their families rationed every gram. Here, as prisoners, food was plentiful. Little did they know that this contrast would quietly dismantle years of indoctrination. Nazi propaganda had insisted that Germany was fighting a decadent enemy, a nation of excess and weakness, a society that could not endure hardship. Yet every day, these prisoners watched American guards eat the same meals, complain about the same minor inconveniences, and return to barracks stocked with supplies that never seemed to run out. There was no sense of desperation here, no collapse, no scraping the bottom of the barrel. For men trained to analyze logistics, truck movements, supply dumps, fuel availability, the conclusion was inescapable. This war was not being decided by bravery alone. It was being decided by production. Some of the prisoners had been quartermasters, others mechanics. A few had worked in German factories before the war. They understood numbers, tonnage, throughput, replacement rates, and what they were seeing terrified them. Work details sent POWs to nearby farms revealed endless rows of crops, harvested with machines instead of exhausted hands, cornfields stretching beyond the horizon, cattle herds larger than entire German districts, grain silos full even in wartime. American farmers spoke casually about quotas and surplus. Surplus, a word that no longer existed in Germany. At Camp Aliceville, German prisoners were assigned to cotton fields and peanut farms. They were paid small wages, credited to camp accounts in accordance with Geneva Convention rules. The money could be used at camp canteens to buy toiletries, snacks, or writing materials. Some bought chocolate. Others bought more food, even though they did not need it. The irony was not lost on them. Back home, money was useless without ration cards. Here, food followed money. The system worked. As weeks turned into months, the psychological shift deepened. Guards noticed it. Camp commanders noted it in reports. Discipline issues declined. Defiance faded. Political arguments among prisoners, once fierce between Nazis and skeptics, grew quieter. Reality had intruded where ideology failed. The men were not being re-educated. They were not lectured. They were not shown films or pamphlets. They were simply fed, and fed well. Against impossible odds, abundance had done what bombs could not. One incident became quietly famous within several camps. In early 1945, during an inspection, a German Oberleutnant reportedly asked an American officer whether the generous rations were temporary, perhaps staged for appearances. The American captain looked at him, confused, and replied simply that this was standard issue. "This is what our soldiers eat," he said. The German officer said nothing. What could he say? That his own men at the front were starving? That his nation no longer had the means to sustain its army? That the enemy he had been taught to despise had outmatched Germany in the most fundamental way possible? Pause. Food is survival. Logistics is war. And war, stripped of slogans, is arithmetic. By early 1945, the numbers no longer favored Germany. The prisoners knew it. As the Allies crossed the Rhine and pushed toward Berlin, news filtered into the camps through newspapers and guarded conversations. Cities falling, units surrendering en masse, supply lines are collapsing entirely. The men behind the wire were no longer surprised. They had seen the end coming long before it arrived on the maps. It had arrived on their plates. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, there were no cheers in the POW camps, only silence, reflection, and a strange sense of inevitability. For many of these men, the moment of defeat had not come with the fall of Berlin. It had come months earlier. Over a meal, they could not reconcile with everything they had been told. And yet, the story does not end there. Because what happened after surrender would leave an even deeper mark, one that would shape how these men remembered America, captivity, and the meaning of victory itself. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Across the United States, church bells rang and factory whistles blew. But inside the prisoner of war camps, there were no celebrations, only stillness. For the German POWs, defeat did not arrive with explosions or advancing tanks. It arrived with a confirmation of what they already knew. The Reich had collapsed. The front lines had ceased to exist. And the future, uncertain, fragile, and frightening, now lay beyond the barbed wire. In the days following surrender, camp routines continued almost unchanged. Roll calls, work details, meals served at the same hours, the same bread, the same meat, the same coffee. The war was over, but the abundance remained. That continuity unsettled many of the prisoners more than any announcement of defeat. Among the men were former lieutenants, Hauptfeldwebel, mechanics, clerks, farm boys, and factory workers. Now, stripped of rank insignia, they were equals in captivity. And with the ideological struggle finished, conversations changed. They no longer argued about victory, they argued about responsibility. In the barracks at Fort Leonard Wood, small groups formed at night. Men spoke in low voices about what they had believed, what they had ignored, and what they had rationalized. Some admitted they had doubted the war years earlier, but kept silent. Others insisted they had never known the full truth. Food remained central to these discussions. One former non-commissioned officer put it plainly: "If they can feed us like this while fighting on 2 oceans, then we were never going to win." No one disagreed. The American guards, many of them veterans themselves, did not gloat. Most were young men from farms and cities across the United States. They had brothers still overseas. Some had lost friends in Normandy, in the Ardennes, in Italy. They were professional, detached, sometimes even polite. The prisoners noticed that too. There were no beatings, no reprisals, no starvation. Discipline existed, but it was measured. Infractions were punished with loss of privileges, not violence. The camps ran on schedules and paperwork, not fear. This contrasted sharply with stories the POWs had heard about camps in the East, stories many had dismissed as exaggerations. Now, faced with the reality of their own treatment, those dismissals became harder to sustain. Little did they know how deeply this experience would shape their memories of the war. In the summer of 1945, POW labor became even more critical. With millions of American men still demobilizing, German prisoners were assigned to agricultural work, road repairs, and non-military construction under strict supervision. They harvested crops that would feed not only Americans, but a starving Europe. The irony was heavy. Men who had marched through conquered lands were now helping sustain the economy of their captors, and they were paid for it. The wages were modest, but real. Some sent money home through approved channels. Others saved it, uncertain of what awaited them in a shattered Germany. Food parcels were allowed. Letters increased. News from home grew darker. Cities in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, railways twisted, factories silent, millions displaced. Meanwhile, in the camps, meals continued uninterrupted. The contrast became unbearable for some. Psychologically, this period marked the final break. The prisoners no longer compared themselves to American soldiers. They compared America to Germany, and Germany came up short in every category that mattered. Production, logistics, stability, the ability to care for its people, even in defeat. Against impossible odds, the United States had fought a global war without exhausting its homeland. Germany had not survived a continental one. For many POWs, this realization carried shame. Not humiliation at being captured, but shame at what had been promised and what had been delivered. They had been told sacrifice would bring victory. Instead, sacrifice had brought collapse. By late 1945, preparations for repatriation began. Not all prisoners would return immediately. Some would remain for months, even years, helping rebuild European agriculture under Allied supervision. As the first groups boarded ships bound for home, they carried memories that no propaganda could erase. the taste of white bread, the smell of real coffee, the knowledge that the enemy they had fought was not weak, but overwhelmingly capable. One former POW later said that the moment he truly understood the war was lost did not come with surrender. It came when he realized that captivity in America felt more stable than freedom in Germany. This was not mercy. It was evidence. Evidence of a system that could sustain war without destroying itself. Evidence of why the conflict had ended the way it did. And evidence that victory is not only decided on battlefields, but in factories, farms, and mess halls. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War.